Epic. This popular word has a long history in the tradition of Western classical epic poetry, a history which we'll survey today with a focus on the Latin epic, the Aeneid. But first, what is classical epic poetry? By classical, we mean part of the Greco-Roman tradition, that is, literature in ancient Greek, then in Latin from the time of the Romans through the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, and finally in the vernacular languages, meaning not Latin, among modern writers who follow the conventions of ancient Greek and Latin epics. Some classical epics you may be familiar with are Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, and Virgil's Aeneid. The most famous medieval epic poems, such as Beowulf, the Norse poetic Edda, the French chansons de geste, Arthurian romances, and their modern descendants. These are not classical epics, but are part of separate traditions in the vernacular languages. But many of these vernacular epics deal with classical subjects, so classical and vernacular often mingled. In the Renaissance, Europe went crazy for all things classical, so more Latin epics were written than ever before. But poets also began experimenting using the vernacular languages, instead of Latin, to write very classical epics, such as Dante's Divine Comedy in Italian, and John Milton's Paradise Lost in English. By the 19th century, very few poets were writing purely classical epics in Latin, but vernacular epic poetry was still going strong, and still quite classically flavored. For example, William Morris wrote what is even now the longest of all English poems at 42,000 lines, the epic The Earthly Paradise, which retells ancient Greek and Germanic stories. But in the 20th and 21st centuries, as poetry has become more experimental and less popular, traditional epics have become less common, though there are a few that buck the trend. Now that we've defined classical, what exactly is an epic, and what is it for? An epic poem is a long narrative poem, often featuring heroes, famous men and women of old, who went on a journey, fought in a war, or interacted with gods or mythical creatures in ways that shaped the world of their descendants, including the poet and the poet's audience. To hear an epic poem sung or recited was for a people to be reminded of the past that defined them. Greeks saw themselves in Homer's warrior kings tossed around by fate. Romans saw themselves in duty-bound Aeneas, and Anglo-Saxons saw themselves in the brave and loyal Beowulf. As an illustration of the idea of the epic, let's imagine an epic poem for Americans. It might celebrate individual liberty by retelling one of America's iconic struggles for the cause of freedom, such as the Revolutionary War, World War II, or the abolition of slavery and the Civil Rights Movement. As a side note, there actually were several American epic poems written in the 19th century, but ironically, the only one that's still admired today is the least traditionally epic, Song of Myself by Walt Whitman. As you can guess from the title, Whitman thought the most quintessentially American subject of praise was not a hero of Americans' communal past, but the individual, myself. In any case, here's a second illustration of the function of an epic. It's somewhat similar to what J.R.R. Tolkien originally intended for his legendarium: to make a body of more or less connected legend, ranging from the large and cosmogonic to the level of romantic fairy story, the larger founded on the lesser in contact with the earth, the lesser drawing splendor from the vast backcloths, which I could dedicate simply to England, to my country. The big difference, though, is that epic is more closely related to the primary world, our world of historical reality, than what Tolkien thought best for myth. He wanted an imagined past, but epic poems regularly describe historical events as well as legend, and so epics are closely bound up with the culture and religion of their people. For example, By epic conventions, it's not unusual that Aeneas, the hero of the Aeneid, goes down to the underworld and hears a prophecy summarizing the conquests of the Roman Empire. And it's not unusual that in the late medieval, early Renaissance epic poem, The Divine Comedy, Dante goes down to hell and witnesses the various punishments inflicted on the damned before traveling through purgatory and heaven. Epic poems are imaginative, but they also tend to be political and religious. For a third and final illustration of the purpose of epics, we'll turn to the 1985 epic poem, The New World, by Frederick Turner. Even though the story is set 400 years in the future, not in the past, its purpose is the same as traditional epics, to give us an imagined history by which we can define ourselves. Turner writes in his introduction, "The fundamental purpose of the New World is to demonstrate that a viable human future, a possible history, however imperfect, does lie beyond our present horizon of apparent cultural exhaustion and nuclear holocaust. Art has the world-saving function of imaginatively constructing other futures that do not involve the Götterdämmerung, that is, Ragnarok, or the end of the world, of mass suicide." Turner explains how epic poetry is uniquely suited for this task. "There are many things that poetry can do that cannot be done by any other literary form. The novel cannot do them. It does not have fully at its disposal the capacities of poetic meter, image, symbol, and allusion, the poetic freedoms offered by figurative language and compression, the mysterious and effective forces of dream and vision, and the poetic power to change the very ground rules of the game. If the novel is like the naturalistic stage drama, and if the lyric poem is like instrumental art music, the epic poem is like opera, a unique form of its own. It may be the most potent instrument for creating those alternate or subjective worlds that we now need to substitute for the Holocaust in our future." Epic poetry is an ancient art form, but it's definitely not dead. So without further ado, let's dive into the tradition of the classical epic. The ancient Greek poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey, are the grandparents of all classical epics. In fact, our word epic comes from the Greek word epikos, which means having to do with epe, literally words, but also epic poem. Epics were also called heroic, or heroikos, poems. The Iliad and the Odyssey were hugely important in ancient Greek culture. If you were an educated Greek, you knew much of these epics by heart. In fact, in one of the Greeks' most popular drinking games, someone recited a line of poetry, usually from the Iliad or the Odyssey, and the next person recited the next line after it, and so forth. Anyone who couldn't remember the next line was kicked out, until the last person left won the game. Tradition says that the Iliad and the Odyssey were written by the blind bard Homer. Scholars debate whether or not Homer existed as a historical, individual person, but if he didn't work alone, because these epics arose out of a long oral tradition of heroic songs, sometime in the 8th century BC. The Iliad graphically depicts bloody battles in the Trojan War, when the Greeks fought for 10 years against the city of Troy in Asia Minor. This may actually have happened in history, though not the way the Iliad tells it, with the constant intervention of gods and goddesses who take sides in the humans' war. The main character in the Iliad is Achilles, whose hubris and anger drive forward the plot, ultimately to Troy's fated destruction. The Odyssey tells of the homeward voyage of the Greek king Odysseus just after the Trojan War. In it, we see a lot less graphic violence and less frequent appearances of the gods than in the Iliad. So, on the surface, the Odyssey may seem like a more light-hearted adventure, but, just like the Iliad, the Odyssey is all about the fortunes and misfortunes of humans as they struggle against powers beyond their control. The ancient Greeks wrote many other epics, but let's skip ahead now to Latin, the language of the Aeneid. To talk about Latin epic, we had to start with Homer, because Latin literature started by copying Greek literature. As the Roman Empire expanded across formerly Greek lands in the Mediterranean Sea, the Romans fell in love with Greek culture. The Roman poet Horace said it best: Graecia capta ferum victorem cepitet artes intulit agresti latio. Conquered Greece took captive her savage conqueror and brought the arts into rustic Latium. And so the first Latin epic poem, the 2nd century Annales by Aeneas, was written in a style which emulated Homer. Aeneas's poem told the history of the Romans, both legendary and contemporary, and it became the standard textbook in Latin schools, just like Homer had been for the Greeks. But in the year 19 BC, a new Latin epic came onto the scene that would become one of the most enduring books in all of history, the Aeneid by Virgil. Virgil was already a famous poet when Emperor Augustus commissioned him to write a new national epic. By this time, many critics considered Aeneas's epic to be rough and unpolished. Besides, the emperor wanted an epic that legitimized his family, the Julian clan, as the rulers of Rome. And so, Virgil couldn't have chosen a better hero for his epic than Aeneas, son of the goddess Venus, aka Aphrodite, a prince of Troy and ancestor of the Julian house, according to legend. Another legend had it that at the end of the Trojan War, Aeneas fled from the burning city of Troy with a group of survivors. They made their way across the Mediterranean Sea and eventually settled in Italy and became the ancestors of the Romans. It was this legend that Virgil retold in the Aeneid, in a smooth-sounding Latin style that made countless allusions and references to the Greek classics, to the delight of his highly educated, aristocratic audience. Even the structure of the epic is Homeric, imitating the Odyssey in the first half, where the Trojan refugees wander across the Mediterranean Sea, and imitating the Iliad in the other half, where Aeneas leads a war against some of the native Italians. I won't walk you through the whole story, but I do recommend the entertaining summary linked near the end of this video if you're not familiar with the storyline. Here, I just want to mention one big question in the Aeneid. Is Virgil's portrayal of Aeneas a compliment to Augustus, or is it an underhanded criticism of his imperialism? Readers have disagreed about this for many centuries, but more recently the two sides have been called the optimistic and the pessimistic interpretation, ever since the 1976 book Darkness Visible, a study of the Aeneid, published right after the Vietnam War, when a lot of Americans were pessimistic about the government. Throughout the epic, Virgil describes Aeneas as pious, which means not quite religiously pious, but loyal and dutiful to one's people, country, and gods. The most famous example of Aeneas's pietas, his sense of duty, is after he has a fling with Queen Dido of Carthage. It would have been easy to settle down there and become the king of a prosperous city, but the gods remind Aeneas of his divinely given mission to go to Italy, and so he tries sneaking away in the night, but Dido catches him, and there's an awkward confrontation which ends in Aeneas leaving anyways. Dido is so heartbroken that she commits suicide. This was the hard-nosed discipline that the Romans could love in a national hero. This was a fitting compliment to the hero's descendant, the emperor. Or was it? Could it be that in Dido's just indignation at Aeneas's broken promises, Virgil is pointing out the collateral damage inflicted in Rome's imperial mission? Here's another important scene for the pessimists. At the very end of the epic, when Aeneas has bested his archenemy Turnus in a duel and stands victorious over him, Turnus begs for mercy, which Aeneas is about to grant, but then he sees the belt of a slain friend that Turnus is wearing as a trophy. Aeneas loses his cool and kills Turnus in a rage, and there the poem ends abruptly. Clearly, Aeneas acts against the Roman ideal set forth in a prophecy earlier in the epic, to spare the defeated. Was this Another critique of Rome's violent imperialism in a supposedly propagandistic epic? Today, many scholars take a middle road between the optimistic and pessimistic interpretations, asking us to put ourselves in the shoes of Aeneas. After all, he's a refugee. His city's been burned to the ground. He loses most of his family. He hardly knows who he is anymore. And he's responsible for leading the other Trojan survivors to a new home and for fulfilling this prophecy that the gods keep reminding him about. With all this eating away at his soul, no wonder Aeneas sometimes acts like a sociopath and makes some terrible decisions. We can debate the character of Aeneas ad infinitum, but what is clear is that the Aeneid was an instant and overwhelming success. It became the book in Latin, studied in all the lands over which the Western Roman Empire stretched. Even after the empire crumbled and Christendom took up its mantle in Europe, the Aeneid was just as powerful an epic, when Virgil's portrayal of divine mission was reinterpreted in a Christian light, or at other times understood pessimistically as a critique of worldly empire. In fact, many medieval readers considered Virgil a prophet of Christianity, a wizard, even with magical powers. With this prophet's book, Roman emperors and English kings faced with a tough decision practiced bibliomancy. That is, they opened up the Aeneid randomly and took whatever line was under their finger as a prophecy of their future, a key to making the right choice in their situation. To many people, the Aeneid was a holy book. So it's not surprising that its style and language became the standard for classical epics for the next millennium and a half. There were other Roman epics after the Aeneid, and later Latin poets borrowed from them too, but nowhere near as much as they emulated Virgil. Often, poets imitated entire passages from the Aeneid. Look at the opening lines of these two Renaissance Bible epics. As you can see, they pay a hefty tribute to the opening lines of the Aeneid, including the alternate first 4 lines, which you won't see in modern editions, because they were probably added later, after the time of Virgil. Remember those vernacular epics that became more and more common in the Renaissance? Well, these vernacular poets, too, held up the Aeneid as one of their best models. Dante, in his epic, even makes Virgil his guide through hell and purgatory. Edmund Spenser wrote of his epic, The Faerie Queene, "I have followed all the antique poets historical, first Homer, then Virgil, after him Ariosto, and lately Tasso." These days, we hardly ever hear the Aeneid praised, or even mentioned at all. But as recently as the middle of the last century, T.S. Eliot called the Aeneid the classic of all Europe. C.S. Lewis was once asked what books most shaped his philosophy of life, and in his answer, the Aeneid came in third. I hope you've gotten a glimpse of why Eliot, Lewis, and many others have been fascinated by Virgil's Aeneid, and how classical epics can be just as powerful today as they have been for thousands of years. Before you start the Aeneid, here are some pointers on how to read Latin epic poetry. For step-by-step guides on reading the hexameters of Latin epic, see the links to videos by Benjamin Johnson coming up soon. Carefully study those videos and practice reading verses from the Aeneid for yourself if you want to appreciate the sound of epic poetry. Here, I'll give you 2 examples of reading the Aeneid aloud. One of these is at the very end of this video because it's pretty long, giving you enough examples so that you can use it as a reference to check yourself as you learn how to do it yourself. In that example, I'll read the verses in a way that makes the meter obvious by stressing syllables according to a beat. Note that this is not the way the words would normally be stressed in prose, and note also that, according to many scholars, this was not how Latin poetry was recited in ancient times. But it's a convenient way to learn the meter. You can learn how to read more elegantly later on if you choose. The other example, which is what you'll hear now, is a few tunes that you can use to sing the Aeneid, which may sound odd to you at first, but singing Latin poetry actually has a long tradition, and it's very helpful in getting an intuitive feel for the meter. So here are the first 11 lines of the Aeneid, sung to a few tunes. Arma virumque cano Troiae qui primus aboris Italiam fato profugus Laviniaque venit litora multi letteris iactatus et alto vi superum saevae memorem iunonis obiram multa quoquet bello passus dum conderet urbem inferret Deos latio genus unde Latinum Albanique patres ad qualtae moenia Romae. Musa mihi causas memora quo numine laeso, quid vedolens regina Deum tot volvere casus, insignem pietate virum tot adire labores, impulerit tantae animis cae lestibus irae. Each of these tunes works on any hexameter line, so once you get a good feel for hexameters, you can use these tunes to practice reading any part of the Aeneid. For another musical performance from the Aeneid, see this video by Tirtarion, the musical group of the Latin school Academia Vivarium Novum. Also, be sure to watch those videos on hexameter if you're new to Latin poetry. And last of all, for your reference as you practice, here are the first 33 lines of the Aeneid, read rhythmically. Arma virumque cano Troiae qui primus aboris Italiam fato profugus Laviniaque venit litora multi letteris iactatus et alto vi superum saevae memorem iunonis obiram multa quoquet bello passus dum conderet urbem inferret Deos latio genus unde Latinum Albanique patres ad qualtae moenia Romae. Musa mihi causas memora quo numine laeso quid vedolens regina Deum tot volvere casus insignem pietate virum tot adire labores impulerit tantae animis cae lestibus irae urbs antiqua fuit Tirii tenuere coloni Carthagitaliam contra Tiberinaque longe ostia dives opum studiis quasperrima belli quam iuno fertur terris magis omnibus unam post habita coluisse samo hic illius arma hic currus fuit hoc regnum dea gentibus esse si qua fata sinant iam tum tenditque fovetque progeniem sedenim Troiana sanguine duci audierat Tirias olim quae verteret arces hinc populum late regem belloque superbum venturex cidio Libiae sic volvere parcas id metuens veterisque memor Saturnia belli prima quod ad Troiam procaris gesserat argis nec detiam causirarum saevique dolores exciderant animo, manet alta mente repostum, judicium paridis spretae quiniuria formae, et genus invis et rapti ganimedis honores, his censa super jactatos aecore toto, Troas reliquias danaat qui mitis Achilli, arcebat longe latio multosque per annos, errabant acti fatis mari omnia circum. Tantae molis erat Romanam condere gentem. Thank you for your attention. Vale.